The turn of the 15th and 16th centuries was a turbulent era of unrest in Finland. The Middle Ages was ending as the Finns would slowly awake to the dawn of the modern age. The dysfunctional Kalmar Union was breaking, with Danish forces repeatedly laying waste to Sweden, including her Finnish territories up to Tavastia. The eastern border was also aflame. The old wrath, which we covered in the previous episode, left a pile of corpses and destruction behind, but failed to resolve the border disputes between Sweden and Moscow. In February, Christian II of Denmark marched to Stockholm and had himself crowned king of the Union. He had invited the nobility to Stockholm, promising to pardon his opponents. They swallowed the bait, and Christian had them imprisoned and performed a separation of the heads from the necks of his male opponents at the city square. This would be known as the Stockholm bloodbath and was done to intimidate the Swedes into submission. Turns out it had the opposite effect. The Swedes rose against the Danish king, led by the nobleman named Gustav Vasa, whose father was one of those executed in Stockholm. By 1523, King Christian was dethroned after a bloody war. Gustav Vasa was crowned King of Sweden, and Österland, that is Finland for those who haven't been paying attention, was declared part of Sweden again. This marks the end of the Middle Ages in Finland. The next roughly 100 years are known as the Vasa Age. This era saw a bunch of changes that modernized the country. So what changed for the average farmer then? Initially, not that much. They still formed the backbone and breadbasket of society, farming and eating pottage, typically the same food for each day of the week. This custom is, by the way, carried on to this day in the liquid form of pea soup on Thursdays. A few years prior, a German priest named Martin Luther had stomped on the Pope's feet with biblical aggression. His aim was to reform the Catholic Church, which he found greedy and corrupt. Although it was likely not Luther's goal, what he set in motion left much of Europe soaked with blood and in ruins, involving the Swedish armies with their Finnish forces as well, but more about that in the next episode. Like much of the state under Vasa's rule, the church underwent reformation. This meant shifting power and wealth away from the church and to the king. This suited the king just fine. The bishop's castle of Kuusisto was demolished, ridding the church of its military throne. It also involved making the church more accessible to the people according to the Lutheran principles. This included translating the Bible into Swedish and Finnish. The man for the task was called Mikael Agricola, Bishop of Turku and a student of Luther himself. He is often known as the father of written Finnish, and this is mostly true, as his ABC-kirja was the first book published in Finnish. It is likely, though, that priests and other literate Finnish speakers had been writing notes for themselves in Finnish before Agricola, but none have been preserved. In the preface of his Bible translation, Agricola lists the pagan gods of Tavastia and Karelia. While the list is by no means an accurate depiction of paganism at the time, it is evidence of surviving heathen beliefs well into the reformed Lutheran Finland. The growing realm needed a history for its people, so one was made up. The Swedes and Finns claimed to descend from biblical heroes and ancient civilizations. This, of course, was nonsense, but that was not important. In addition to the new literature, the first detailed map of the Nordics was published in 1539. It was called Carta Marina and created by the Swedish cartographer and clergyman Olaus Magnus. In the map's southern end of Finland, King Vasa founded Helsinki in 1550 as a competitor to the buzzing trade hub of Reval, known today as Tallinn. Much to his disappointment though, Helsinki was built in the wrong place behind a poorly navigable archipelago. Founding cities is cool, but what would an episode of this series be without wars against Russia? As we remember, the Russo-Swedish border was long disputed, and raids by and to both sides were common. This escalated to a full-blown war in 1555, known in Finnish as the Great Russian War. Although the Finnish ski troops are best known from the Winter War hundreds of years later, Sweden used them to great advantage under the command of Juho Maununpoika. Sweden besieged and failed to capture the strategically important Oreshek castle, and their advance towards Moscow was halted. Rumors of Ivan the Terrible mustering a massive force for counterattack spread, and the Swedish-Finnish army retreated. In January 1556, the Russian forces flooded into the Karelian Isthmus, killing everything in their way, but failed to capture Viborg. A truce was reached, with no formal changes to the border once again. Not that it mattered much, for another war was fought in 1570 to 1595, known in Finnish as the Long Wrath. On Finland's soil it was largely guerrilla warfare, associated with the legendary warlord Pekka Vesainen. Russia was also fighting Polish, Lithuanian, Danish and Norwegian forces, which suited Sweden well enough. A peace treaty was signed in 1595, and this time it included redrawing parts of the map, with Sweden gaining areas in northern Estonia and Finland, whereas Russia got its hands on Ingria again. While the farmers were ravaged by war, the nobility were tasting the flavors of the Renaissance, which had finally reached the north after emerging in Italy a couple of centuries earlier. A key figure was the Queen Catherine Jagiellon and her Renaissance court in Turku Castle. As you can imagine, all the fighting had taken its toll on the Finnish peasants. Besides the heavy taxes ordered to fund the wars, they were required to host and supply the armies even after the war had ended. The nobility, on the other hand, benefited from the wars as they gained new territories and loot. Meanwhile, the king Sigismund fought for the throne against his uncle Charles. The governor of Finland, Klaus Fleming, was a supporter of Sigismund. Charles promised to relieve the peasants of the burden of hosting the armies in order to gain support for his fight for the throne. Fleming responded by strengthening his iron grip of the country and terrorizing the peasants. The situation kept getting more and more perkelefied, and the peasants had had enough. By the end of 1595 they took up arms, led by a nobleman named Jaakko Ilkka. Their revolt and marching south inspired the mustering of similar peasant armies across the country, but they were no match for Fleming's heavily armed and trained troops. Two of the Civil War's numerous battles ended with the Swedish army promising to pardon the rebels, immediately slaughtering them after they laid down their arms. After crushing the rebels, Fleming's armies plundered the countryside in the spirit of fairness. The King Sigismund, whom Fleming supported, was dethroned by Charles, who then conquered Finland and killed much of the Finnish nobility loyal to Sigismund. The mass execution of political opponents starts to sound familiar at this point. The wars had left the Finnish population weak, and this was not helped by the Great Famine of 1601, which spread death and disease across the land. The warm climate of the early Middle Ages had cooled, which certainly didn't help. Luckily for the Finns though, they got to enjoy permanent peace and prosperity ever since. Just kidding. What followed was even more wars and death, as Sweden rose to be a great military power. But more about that in the next episode. Do consider subscribing in order not to miss it. Also, if you like this stuff, consider becoming a member of the channel. With a small monthly payment, you will get my eternal gratitude plus 10 points and a parrot stamp. And as always, if Finnish mythology and history are close to your heart, see a cardiologist and then check out my other videos.